In a 2023 article in the Boston Globe, author Paul Tremblay claims that, by design, horror transgresses and holds up a mirror to society, and that horror challenges moral boundaries. The monster is monstrous because it is just on the other side of humanity. Inevitably, this highlights our understanding of what a normal human should be and brings us face to face with whatever crosses that line. Horror, therefore, can shed light on our prejudices and help us to challenge the transcendental norms of our day. But what happens when the stories we read or the movies we watch deliberately implicate the reader or the watcher? What happens when they play with our expectations and shine a light on our own participation in horror?
Tremblay's most recent novel, Horror Movie, does just that. And it is our task as the consumer of this story to help determine if the horror genre is, as most non-horror fans believe, just an excuse to dabble in the sickest of fantasies, or if horror reflects and reveals truths about a culture and the people in it. In today's episode, we sit down with Paul to talk about the novel, its potential status as meta-horror, and whether or not the ending is ambiguous. Along the way, we discuss the reputation that horror fans and creators have. We recount some transformative experiences of joy within the horror community, and we investigate the transgressive power of horror. So, grab your cursed scripts and settle into your cozy cocoon as we navigate the rich, complex, and entertaining world of horror movie. Come for the horror, stay for the joy.
This is Horror Joy, a podcast celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. I'm Jeff Stoynoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
Associate Professor Brian, that's new.
Yeah, just got tenured, which is really nice because I think that means that I cannot be fired for having a horror podcast. So, sorry, Jeff.
I guess I'll be hanging on. You can pay my bills when the time comes.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see about that. Today's episode, we talked to horror author Paul Tremblay. I thought it was really fascinating conversation about his book, about a lot of other things. Is there anything in particular that you found to be interesting?
I really enjoyed Paul's takes on a lot of our questions and how he thought about the process of writing his book and how he expressed that to us. A lot of the expectations I had for how he would respond to our questions were not met, and I think in the best possible way. He surprised me throughout the interview, and a lot of the things that I think you and I maybe both were assuming or speculating on turned out to be maybe red herrings or maybe just us looking a little too deeply, which, you know, we get into that in the interview with Paul. So stay tuned for his thoughts on that too. But it's refreshing to talk to someone who was so down to earth and is an author and has such an accomplished sort of record of novels at this point. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I need to go back and reread Horror Movie at this point to think about some of the scenes in light of his answers. What about you, Brian?
I loved talking to Paul. He's such an insightful and kind person. Like you're saying, he's down to earth. He gives just really interesting answers. For me, his response about the horror community is probably the most interesting. Not only his interaction with people that like horror generally, but his interaction with other horror authors. He talks about how important it has been for him as an author. And for me, there's something so incredibly joyful about thinking about horror authors getting together and encouraging each other and reading each other's work and just basically allowing each author to kind of be an author and say, that's cool. That's a thing that you can do, and it's okay. This is a cool thing that you're doing as a math teacher or whoever you are, whatever else you do. I thought that was just such a cool thing to kind of hear and to listen to. So yeah, the relationship with the horror community and his experiences with those are so fascinating.
I'm still floored he's never read the Goosebumps. I'm still trying to process that, given how much you and I talked about how we could see overlap between these two.
It's true. I think we have to unpack that at some point on this podcast in a longer form. Stay tuned for the interview with Paul Tremblay. It is insightful, fascinating, entertaining, really great. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Horror Joy. We're joined today by Paul Tremblay, one of my favorite authors. I've been reading Paul for a few years now and just love all of his stuff. Paul is the author of multiple books, including A Head Full of Ghosts, Disappearance at Devil Rock, Survivor Song, The Beast You Are, and most recently, Horror Movie, which came out on June 11th. It's an amazing book. We're going to spend some time talking about it today. Both Jeff and I read it, and we really loved it. So we're going to get into a conversation with Paul today about that, and we're excited to go.
Well, thanks. I would say thank you for having me here, Brian and Jeff. And yeah, all those books you mentioned are full of joy.
With that comment there, Paul, we'll get right into it. Tell us about your experiences of joy with horror. Are there any examples in movies or books that bring you joy from horror, whether your books or other movies or the like?
That's such a cool question and a concept of joy and horror. Because I've honestly never really thought of it, because partly it's like I've never really known conscious life without being either afraid of horror stuff or being a fan of horror stuff. That includes like me as a 7-year-old watching Godzilla movies on the weekends, and then like it was Creature double feature, and then the movie after that was typically like a Hammer horror film, or most of the time was like a bad 50s or 60s B movie, but they still scared the hell out of me as a kid. But yeah, on one level, if I enjoy the movie, I mean, there's joy, like even if it's scary and disturbing. But one that comes immediately to mind is Evil Dead 2. And when I first saw that, I think I was in my mid-20s. My brother, who's 5 years younger than me, he was a gore hound as a kid. And I was like, I like supernatural stuff, but I was squeamish and easily scared. So when he finally convinced me after I graduated college to watch Evil Dead 2, I felt like my first exposure to horror was like all these movies that I saw in the 80s and the Godzilla stuff. But then Evil Dead 2 was like, whoa. To me, that was like a joyous horror experience because it's fun. It did feel dangerous too, like, but in a cool way. And it's just like the kinetic energy of that film. It was just something that's still like, I watched it with my daughter last summer. She's made like a list of movies. She's 19 now of things that she wanted to see. So I was very happy that she and her friends enjoyed that movie quite a bit. Because, there is that mix of horror comedy, but it's still pretty disturbing at times, and like that weird cartoon line that walks. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me for joy and horror.
Oh, that's great. I love the idea of danger being part of the joy as well. I've seen that you have these kind of strong relationships with folks, both in the horror community generally, but with other horror writers. I'm just really curious about how you kind of would characterize the horror community as joyful, and whichever one you want to go with is, how do these friendships with other horror creators kind of contribute to that sense of joy when we think about horror?
First, with a caveat, like every community is going to have their bad actors, and people who aren't up to any good and obviously, do terrible things. That all said, the horror community has been a pretty, certainly for me, but I think increasingly so for more people, that don't look like me. It's become a much more welcoming community. There's still its problems, but without getting into those, and not to dismiss those because those are very important, but to focus on the question about, for me, it was a fundamental thing that helped my writing, that I became friends with other writers. In my case, because, I was a math teacher, no one at school was doing what I was doing, and I really had interest in that. And when I was really getting serious about writing in the early 2000s, horror sort of wasn't where it is now in terms of like the pervasiveness within the culture. It's always been there off to the side, but I definitely feel like it's become like this big monster, pun intended. Yeah, so when I first went to conventions, really my first tries to going to conventions didn't go well because it was hard to be like outgoing and like you see all these people and they already know each other and you just start feeling self-conscious. It's like high school all over again. The weird part is like as writers, you're now expected to be like these social creatures where like most of us became writers because we're much more comfortable by ourselves typing and reading. But yeah, once I met like, people like John Langan and Laird Barron and, Sarah Langan and, some other people that I've known for, almost 20 years now, there was worth, obviously any friendship's worth it, but like that we're all experiencing the same thing and trying to do, we're all writing different ways, but we're all sort of messing around with this horror thing. To me, I just found so much inspiration from it, and so much like validation. Not that they all said, hey, this is great stuff, but just the idea that these really cool, smart, intelligent people wanted to play in the same sandbox, to me felt like, oh, it's okay to do this. So yeah, I would not have written any, I don't know, whatever place I am now, like I would not have gotten there without them.
I love that kind of sense in which finding community is important. And being able to see that, I got to meet you in Providence, Rhode Island, and that kind of confirmed for me that there's just all these people that are writing horror and they're joyful people. And I love that. So thank you for that answer.
Sure.
I think we want to jump into talking about Horror Movie, your newest book. which is amazing. So Jeff, what question do you have for Paul today?
Yeah, I'll echo Brian. I thought the book was amazing. I'll admit this is my first entry into your ooh, if you will. It's the first book I've read by you, and I really liked it. I did see Knock on the Cabin Door, the movie version, which Brian tells me I need to read the book because there's some things that they changed that you are not a fan of. So,
and I enjoyed that you even made the title grammatically correct, because the movie's just not Knock at the Cabin, which, like, again, like, what does that mean?
With Horror Movie, we both read this as kind of like a meta horror in a way, where you're both writing a horror story and writing about horror stories. So how deliberate are these levels of metafiction throughout the novel?
I mean, I guess ultimately, pretty deliberate, because, you get to a certain point where, like, oh, this is the book that I wrote. But, like, honestly, a lot of it is trusting your subconscious as you go. The earliest visions of what this story would be, the first thing that started it for me was like, oh, I saw this really smart conversation on YouTube about Texas Chainsaw Massacre between Walter Chow and John Darnielle, and that sort of sent me into a rabbit hole. And I was like, oh, the set for Texas Chainsaw was really unsafe. Like, I wanted to investigate that and play around with it. And it started with, what would drive these smart, talented people, a whole collective of them, to take such chances in the name of art, right? Whether or not the movie in my book that they make is good or not, like, they're convinced that they're making something, with their whole sort of spirit, vibe, etc. And when I had that idea, I was very excited, because I wanted to try to bring some sort of feel of a movie to a book, where most of the time, or not most of the time, all the time, I'm very conscious of trying to make the book the way to tell the story, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not thinking about a movie adaptation or anything like that. I mean, I guess the last thing I would add is, so for me, I didn't become a reader for pleasure until much later than most writers, certainly almost all writers probably. I really didn't become, I read in high school. I was a dutiful student, but just, reading for fun, it really didn't happen until after college, where I was a math graduate student. So for me, like, my introduction, and for my first 20 years of my life, let's say, what I knew about story, its structure, even if it was just like a nascent observational one, not something I dug into, but like my understanding of story was solely through film. There was this shift in my 20s where I was like, whoa, I just got to start, playing catch up and read all these books. So I don't know. So some of that, like, wrestling match was in the book. The meta part of it, I don't know. Sometimes I just can't resist. Because I like it when horror things feel real. And, like, a lot of times meta to me feels real because it's starting to bleed through into your experience.
It's interesting to hear that your first experience with narrative and horror is film. This is something that Brian and I talk a lot about. Like, even though I am an English professor, film is my entry point for horror. I worked in the movie theater for a long time, and this actually then segues nicely into the next part of this question, which is that amazing scene in the book where the audience, both of the book and of the horror movie, are required to stop and wait. Can you just, like, maybe talk more about that? What's your motivation there? What do you see it doing? I thought it was so interesting in what it did. And, like, I don't want to, like, sort of shade anyone's opinion of how to read it, but if you can maybe just talk about that a bit.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Connected with you. When I write novels, I always have one or two scenes. To me, they're like the carrot at the end of the stick scenes. I like to think of them. They're typically past 2/3 of the waypoint of the book, like toward the end. And those are the scenes like, oh, I can't wait to write that. But, like, I will never skip ahead and write it, because if I did, then I wouldn't have a book, because I wouldn't go back and do, like, all the hard stuff. Like, I feel like I have to, do all the hard middle stuff to earn my way to that scene. So anyway, that scene, the extended scene where we're just seeing, like, the doorway waiting for the thin kid to pop out, that was something I was really excited to write. Even though, like, I can't fully say what I was going to do when I got there, I just knew it was like, oh, this movie was going to have this scene where it's just this static shot for 5 minutes and you have to wait. Part of it was just, like, as a viewer, like, that's for me, the most tense scenes of horror movies is when you know something's going to happen. I mean, that's even, like, the definition that Hitchcock gives for suspense.
Tell the audience there was a bomb under that table.
That's right. Like, there's a bomb under the table. The suspense.
The whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information.
If you as the reader know this thing is there and it's going to explode, but you don't know when it's going to explode, that's a suspense part of it.
You've got the audience working.
So this was taking it to the extreme. So Oh no, once I got there, like I didn't have a total plan. I just sort of like went with it. Like I just tried to imagine what would my viewing experience be of watching this. Also, what would imagining what other people's viewing experience would be. And then having the third layer is this screenwriter, Chloe. Why did she put it in there? What's the purpose of it? Like, what's her interpretation of it? So those were like the three things I was trying to keep in mind when I just gave myself an excuse to just like expand and expand for those 5 minutes. And 5 minutes in film is an eternity if you're just sitting there staring at it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that answer. Some of that scene really reminded me of, and some of the other parts of the book too, of a Michael Haneke kind of movie, like Funny Games, right? That kind of meta horror.
Okay, that was the test run. Now we're gonna go for the Olympic gold.
Mm-hmm.
Or there are scenes that he has where there's some scene, I can't remember the movie now, where somebody's playing ping pong and you just watch them for like a minute and a half. It's not 5 minutes, but a minute and a half is a long time. And you just go through that process. Such a cool scene.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, if that movie were ever to get made, like I really hope someone would at least do like a 2 minute scene. Maybe you don't have to go the full 5, but give us at least 2. I don't know. We'll see.
Make it the full 5.
Yeah,
Like,
make it the full
5.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that would be incredible if that could get done.
Yeah.
I think one of the motivations for thinking about joy and horror together was, in part, the articulation you gave to horror in that Boston Globe article. Read that and it just resonated with me. I thought that was such an insightful, brief take on horror. And one thing that I thought about when I was reading this book was it seems as though the book is in some way making me as the reader or the watcher of horror movies understand what I'm doing. This is what I'm expecting. And it kind of shines that light on me in some way. It shines a light on the world. So just wanted to know kind of your thoughts on that. If you had more to say about the way that horror works to do that kind of thing to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely thinking, asking those questions of myself. Like, I mean, especially as, someone's been writing horror for, a little while, as you probably can imagine, and you guys probably get asked this too. If you expose that you're horror fans to your schools, like, why do you read that? Or why do you like horror? Why do you write horror? And, most of the time I want to give like a flippant answer. But also, I mean, I'm glad people think to ask that because I love that horror. And I think that horror should remain at the edges of the mainstream, like prodding at it, asking it difficult questions. To me, that's what my favorite horror stories do. There's this transgression. There's this break with, it's a break with how the mainstream thinks or the mainstream culture thinks, and then how do you deal with it? And I find that it's just incredibly fascinating. And on the other side of it, like besides a break with the mainstream, like if a horror story is just a reveal of a terrible truth, right? Most of the time in my stories, it's pretty grim stuff. And like a lot of things I enjoy tend to be pretty grim, but I weirdly find hope and joy in that reveal or the shared recognition of that truth. That someone else recognizes, the filmmaker or the person who wrote the book and me reading or watching it, that we all recognize, oh, something's really wrong. I find joy and hope in that, even if it's a pretty, not hopeful story. So I think that's part of the reason for the lasting power of horror. It's just like someone else feels like this too. I mean, I think that could be said for all connection in art, right? Art is communication, but in horror, it just feels like that an even more exposed sort of nerve, that gets touched. And, some people really get a charge out of that like I do. And I don't know, some don't.
Yeah, I mean, I love the kind of connection you made to art there, which leads me to this next question that I was, okay, again, so I don't know if it's okay to kind of zoom in on these scenes here, but I love this part where the thin kid describing a piece of art. Mm-hmm. And right, so the teacher says, scribble as much as you can, make it as random as you can. Yeah. And I'll see something in that. And it happens. And the thin kid's like, I can't unsee what was given to me. And so I'm curious, right? One of the things that I like to imagine is that there's unthought thoughts in good work. And it seems like there's a lot of that for you, right? You give us the text. Is there a sense in which, you listen to academics, you listen to Jeff and I talk about your book, and it's like, oh no, you're trying to make something out of a scribble, and I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to unsee it, or that my audience won't be able to experience it differently
Right.
because these silly academics have kind of, given you some meaning that could be there, but maybe not intended. Yeah, just sorry, that's a bit of a rambling question, but
So my favorite works of horror, what I tried to do with this book in particular, I mean, because it does ask questions all the time, and I think even, geez, I forget which character. I think actually multiple characters, like the Marley, the director character, says like, what she loved about the original movie. It's just like this weird, inexplicable thing, and that's what she's drawn to. It's not necessarily a morality fable where like there's this clear message. It's just ineffable, and if you understand it on this weird, sort of like liminal, spiritual, and not in a religious way, but way. Like one of my favorite writers is Michael Sisko, and I always say about his books, sometimes I can't tell you what the hell's even going on, but I get it in a different way. I get it in an emotional way. It took this book 300 pages to describe an emotion. That's the only way you could describe that set of feelings, to me, is what the best art does. Yeah, so the fun part with that art assignment that the Thin Kid remembers, that came into the story unplanned. That was me just like trusting my subconscious, which is so much of the process of writing. And that if you put something in, then if you can't explain yourself why it's there, or if you can't justify, I should say explain, if you can't say this is why I want it here, then it's got to go. But no, that was, for whatever reason, I vividly remember, being in, either second or third grade, substitute teacher, as described in the book. And I remember like thinking, like the Thin Kid does, oh yeah, I'm going to draw it. There's no way she's going to find anything in this. And when she saw it, it was like the Magic Eye poster thing, like this weird bird cocoon thing. And, I'm so glad my subconscious helped me out, because it certainly became like a little bit of a theme for the Thin Kid with the cocoon. And, what do you see? How do you see it? Thank you, weird brain. And maybe part of it is just like, I've done it enough. I can't tell you if it succeeds or not, because certainly not with every book, but like being open to like the weird, ineffable horror story. I don't know. That's just like my favorite thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think all of us have experiences where we make something and then people find meaning in it that we maybe didn't intend or didn't see there. So I think that's really interesting that experience so long ago has been formative in this way. To that end, sort of maybe speaking to performing, in this book, there seem to be some themes of performing horror. When the Thin Kid goes to these conventions as an adult, he sort of has to perform horror in a certain way. We see his sort of actions juxtaposed with the guy from Friday the 13th. Is there authenticity here? Like, is this something where, you've talked about how you were a math teacher before becoming an author. So now as an author, you go to these conventions and people expect you to be like very outgoing and sort of maybe gregarious even. I guess, how do you see this relationship between performing and horror?
That's a great question. The scene as described in the book was referencing, I'd been to this convention called Scares That Cares down in Virginia. And the first 2 times I went, they had it mixed with writers and horror movie actors. And I don't know, it was sort of like a weird thing to me, because there was like a little bit of a cognitive dissonance insofar as like there's Jason, there's, Keith David, there's like these people that, I've watched their movies so many times. And this is not a judgment. They're there like I am. I'm selling books and they're selling autographs and pictures and, but also just like talking to fans. So like there's all these like weird ways that I'm experiencing this, because, I walked up to Keith David and I got a photo and, talked to the ones that the fans that I am. So like I had this like weird fan performative writer thing. And I don't know, I just thought it was like I wanted to write about that sort of experience of the Thin Kid, because part of it was I also thought it was a realistic portrayal of what would happen if this character became a part of like this cult hit movie of a movie that was never made. What does that do to him? Like, what does that do to his mental space, which was already seemingly pretty compromised? Or I don't know if compromise is the best word, but like, I don't know, like all of that, the performativeness, like what's real, what's not real, what's art, what's artifice. And the fun part was I could ask all those questions sort of open-endedly in the book, just to hopefully, go for the feel for the whole thing.
there's parts where it makes us think about the horror of capitalism in a sense where it seems a demand in some way to sell yourself. So you're performing, but you're selling something, right? You're selling your books, you're selling a kind of mystique or something about that. And I think even going back to that question about community, do you find that the horror of selling or horror of performing, the community dampens that a little bit?
That's a great question. I would say that's like a hard thing. That's like a hard line that I think the community struggles with. And what I mean by that is like, well, this will air after I've been to StokerCon, which is a big convention that the Horror Writers Association throws. So everyone there is going to be a horror writer. We're all fans, but it's not a fan convention. It's just this is a horror writer convention. So on one level, everyone's there going to be, I should say everyone, but there's going to be people like, oh, I have to go to network or I have to sell to each other, you know, and there's the pressure to buy books from friends or people that you know. And it is this sort of this weird thing. I know a British horror writer who stopped going to writer conventions. He'll only go to like conventions that are for readers or for moviegoers or for fans as opposed to writers because he felt like I want to connect with the readers, not the writers. I think some of that, like the line where maybe the community has like a lot of stresses is like the idea of having to support everybody, having to buy everybody's book. And then if you don't, our feelings hurt. And then it's a weird thing. Aside from all the capitalism stuff, you know, which we could talk for a long time, like just even more like now, like a quarter of a century into the century, like the idea that I was asked to like go on TikTok. I'm like, I'm not going on TikTok. Like no one needs to watch videos of me, you know, to sell books. And some of that is my own like personal neuroses and Gen X old punk sort of thing. Like I'm not doing videos. I mean, there's nothing innately wrong with it when you think about it rationally. So I don't know how the rest of the community feels about it because most of them have TikTok. So I don't know.
Yeah, that actually might segue into the next question that I was planning to ask. You've kind of talked previously about taking some inspiration from your own kids. And as you've gone along, your kids have obviously gotten older and some of the characters have also gotten older. Just didn't know if you thought you saw your kids in Cleo, Carson, or Valentina, or, and this is another thing you've talked about, did you see yourself in the Thin Kid in some way?
Oh, yeah, I definitely saw a lot of myself in the Thin Kid. I think I let more of my less generous, you know, the side of your brain where it maybe is less generous in dealing with others, especially when he's like a 50-year-old. Yeah, because when he's narrating present day, he's pretty cynical and snarky. And I mean, him and the director talking are fine, but like obviously he does not like the producer or what the producer does. But like, you know, when he's the 20-year-old making the movie, he's a lot more vulnerable and sort of open to what's going to happen to him. So yeah, I'd say there's a lot of, you know, there's physical similarities to me and the Thin Kid and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a chunk of me in everything that I write. I think that's true for every writer. It's funny, Cleo, Valentina, and Carson are not my kids. You know, they're certainly, I imagine them as more Gen X, although with permission, like the physical description of Cleo and the physical description of Valentina are two of my daughter's best friends. But those characters are definitely not who they are. And I know that's probably gonna be hard for them when they read the book. But for me, because I do it all the time, it's pretty cool how, in my head, like, you know, I'll often start with someone's just physical characteristics. And even if they're familiar to me or actually based on someone, as soon as they start speaking in the book or doing stuff, it's just a different person. But no, I mean, it's an anxiety that my kids have gotten older because so many of the books deal with families and stuff. So like I made a joke recently about, I guess I have to write Empty Nest Horror soon. I don't know if anyone's going to want to read that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's an audience for that, definitely.
Yeah, so Paul, in this book, Brian and I picked up on maybe some currents of like exploring mental illness and what that looks like, particularly maybe with Thin Kid, a horror of loneliness, maybe trauma, maybe identity, trying to figure out who he is. Cleo with her suicidal ideation. Yeah. So I don't know if you could maybe speak to that a bit, how you see mental illness and horror working together.
That's a really good question. With this book, I didn't necessarily think of the mental illness aspect of it as like entwined with horror. You know, I don't necessarily believe that's part of it. I think a lot of it's just exploring my own sort of thoughts and experiences. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. I guess I was going to say, like, it seems like a lot of writers I know and horror fans do struggle with mental illness. But like, I have no idea if that's just anecdotal or not. Like this, you know, I mean, in some ways it seems to be like a conservative thing to say, like, oh, all these weirdos like horror. I mean, yeah, it's true. I like to think all these weirdos like horror, but having struggles with mental health does not make you a weirdo. So again, you know, some of that was just, well, I figured, you know, what the Thin Kid would go through would have him literally changed, you know, like the cocoon and the bird in the cocoon by the time he gets to the end of the book. And for Cleo, some of that was, again, like in the moment, like this is who her character was, but I also had to build up to what was the terrible thing that was going to happen at the end of the book. I sort of knew that was what was going to be sort of the thing at the end of the book that involved like her mental health and not just have it be like a Brandon Lee accident on set kind of thing. There's a version of this book where I wrote like a liner notes, like behind the scenes of the book. And I mentioned in that, it's like, you know, there's definitely some mental health stuff going on here, but like, I don't really want to talk about it. That's what I wrote. And it's partly just because I don't know if I can talk about it intelligently. I think I did a much better job of explaining it or not explaining it by just like, yeah, read what happens in the book, and that's sort of a strange connection. Or if there is a connection, I don't know. I think I avoided that question.
I think it's a fair response, and I'll just say that I think that theme feels rich in the book, and I like your response because it's like I can sing it better than I say it, right? And you've given us characters to live in, and the kind of ways in which Cleo puts her hands in her pocket. It feels rich, and it feels worth the conversation, but you've given it to us in a way that I think is helpful.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I guess I would only add, because it's just occurring to me now, like, we were talking earlier about horror being ineffable, like for a lot of the best stuff, like it's something that gets under your skin because you really can't describe it. I mean, if there is a connection, I think, mental illness makes you feel that way as well. Like, especially if you're watching a loved one go through it, like you can understand or you can intellectualize, oh, they're going through this, but it becomes very hard. Like, you think, why aren't you just better? I think that's something I did in the Pallbearers Club, where Art Barber was very clearly depressed, but he was really annoying. But I mean, for me, it was like a little bit of a empathy test. For, like, yeah, like people going through this, they're not going to say what you want them to say or do what you want. They're really struggling, and it's hard when you can't see the physical wound to help them or to understand. I guess the last thing I would say, I often find that when I go from novel to novel, there's like a little bleed through. And I kind of look for that purposefully, like as a jumping off point. Art Barber and the Thin Kid are the same physically as described. And there's sort of like a mental health connection between the two books too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I appreciate how you're talking about the liner notes there, how you just don't want to talk about it. And I think there's something to be said for, as Brian said, like singing rather than saying, or showing rather than saying, that sort of ambiguity that is possible there. And to that end, without getting into spoilers, because we don't want to get into like too many spoilers about the ending of the novel, I'm curious about your philosophy on endings. My experience with this novel, it seems ambiguous. Brian suggests this is a theme that sort of you like playing with. So if you could maybe talk about that for us.
Ambiguity in fiction is certainly one of like my obsessions. But if I'm going to employ, I really try to make sure it isn't just like a cheap twist, and that it's part and parcel of the theme of the book, or like it could not have been written, or at least I didn't think it could have been written like in a different way. And honestly, at this point, like I'm in this weird space where I've written a whole bunch of novels now. Like this is like my 8th one. If I ever do think about like other readers, I think about the ones that don't like the ambiguity, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to mess with them some more. And so maybe like this book isn't as ambiguous as like some of the other stuff, but me being a pain in the ass aside, I think like I keep going back to ambiguity because it feels like real life to me. It feels like, if this thing that I'm writing about were to happen, this is what it would feel like. We wouldn't be sure what's happening. If there was going to be an intrusion of the supernatural, something I don't necessarily believe in, I don't know if I would recognize it. Or if it did happen, I would probably, within the hour or within the day, be like, oh, you know what? And find a way to explain it away. That would be so subtle and weird and indescribable. I find myself continually sort of going back to that notion of, if there is some sort of supernatural from or if like, just mess around with like the liminal space. Just have it feel like slightly off. I want things to feel real, and then you just have that little bit of like tilt. For me, that makes it, that's where the dread and fear and stuff comes from.
I wonder, just maybe as a quick follow-up to that, so the theme of this podcast is horror and joy, and where the two sort of intersect, or maybe how they're parallel, or what have you. Folks get very uncomfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah.
And I think for many folks, like as you say, like this is where the supernatural enters, this is this liminal space, this is what people might refer to as the uncanny. But it seems that you take some joy though in this ambiguity. And so I wonder if that's maybe one of these ways where we're seeing these two sort of maybe at times oppositional feelings that actually work well together.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And Brian referenced this article I wrote for the Globe, and I think I talked about like, there's the scares, but like if you think there's an intrusion, there's a moment of like, oh wow, that's really cool. There's something more than just like the real world, right? Or there's something there that I wasn't expecting to be there. Even though if it's terrifying, there's that moment of like discovery. So I think that's always there for horror, as opposed to people who don't like ambiguous things. I get it. I think there's a big subset of people who like, man, my life so messed up. Like, I don't want my fiction to be messed up. But I also think in the United States in particular, it being such a Christian nation, obviously there are many other religions, but like that's sort of the dominant, certainly for one side, the political aisle. Man, I think anytime you go in a horror story near ambiguity, I think most horror stories at least subconsciously peck at what happens when you die. Because I mean, most horror stories, frankly, deal with death in some way. And so if you play around with ambiguity, I kind of feel like, you're not necessarily even thinking about it, but it gets at that nagging, wait a minute, what happens when we die? The ultimate ambiguity that awaits us all. And I don't know, like I have a pet theory, I can't prove it. Maybe it's just me trying to explain away why people don't like my endings, is that, yeah, I think some people really are uncomfortable with that and they don't want to be uncomfortable.
I'm going to do something off the cuff here. This is a spoiler, potentially. Jeff and I talked a lot about the ending, and my take, this is my reading, that this is not really what happened. He's allegedly writing an audiobook, and that he's giving us a new part of the story, that he's selling this story. I think, Jeff, you initially read it a little bit differently, like maybe this was happening. Didn't know if you wanted to reveal if you had thoughts on what quote unquote actually happened at the end.
That's funny. So like I'll begin by saying like for other books, like I can honestly say like A Head Full of Ghosts, for example, I purposely divorced myself from thinking, hey, there's a true ending and there's not a true ending in regards to whether there's something supernatural happening. And same with like Cabin at the End of the World. Like I haven't thought one moment past the last line of that book. But in the years since, I now have an opinion on the ending, but it's just an opinion. Like when I was writing it, I tried to keep it perfectly balanced. I would say with horror movie, same thing. And I think that might just be a function of like I've done a bunch of, Paul Bear's sort of, maybe it's ambiguous or not, which is fine. Like, I like that people can have like their own sort of ending to it. So yeah, I like that you both have different endings. I think, when I was writing it, I really tried to imagine it like as like sort of the, the crazy ending that it as is, like, try to, really visualize and try to describe all that was happening, but also that could just be the thin kid doing it. He's a rascally guy.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. I'm happy to keep that more ambiguous. And I think that that's so important. I think one thing that I really want to make sure is that there's so many readings that you can give to almost any story, but your stories, I think, open up different worlds. And for me, there's joy in that too. There's joy in expanding the world and even creating it with other people. So taking a bit of a right turn here, I saw that you have a kind of middle grade horror novel coming out. And this is maybe your next big project. I know that both my daughters are big readers. I'm really excited to say, hey, this is what you should read next, or let's read it together. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that book.
Yeah, sure. So it's going to be out in the summer of 25. So just about a year after Horror Movie. And I finished the edit, so it's done. Like I turned in the edits like a month or so ago. I wasn't planning on writing it. Like it wasn't like a career plan. Because of Knock at the Cabin, I was able to take a year sabbatical from teaching. And that's when I probably wrote like 4/5 of Horror Movie. I'd started it the spring before I left teaching for a year. But, I wrote it mostly during that year off. But I finished it very early. And I was like, oh, and then I just had this idea, about a story about a sixth grader. I was like, oh, then maybe this should be like a middle grade sort of level kind of story. And it was kind of, writing, I would say it's fun because it's work. But I did enjoy, the result for sure. I didn't intend it to be a little bit about, it ends up being about like the experience that teachers and kids went through during the first years of the pandemic. The first image that, this isn't a big spoiler. The first image that started the book was, oh, there's this really lonely kid at his house. And some weird stranger old guy comes over with a friend. And when he arrives, he's got just like a burlap sack. And when he opens it, inside is this like living clay boy mannequin looking thing where he doesn't have full facial features, just like almost like the shadowy indentations of eyes and a hint of a nose kind of thing. But he can move and like gesture and he can write a few things down and like he'll sculpt like a smile on his face. And then things get weirder as he sleeps over, like each day that goes by kind of thing. Which is like a creepy thing. I don't know if either of you ever heard of Mummenschanz. When I was a kid, there was like some weird Swedish troupe where they would dress like in black leotards and have clay on their heads, and they would like fashion like really realistic faces on their heads. So it was really kind of creepy. They would appear on the Muppet Show sometimes.
This is the part of the show where I usually spend a few moments talking to the guest stars, but in this case, the Mummenschanz don't talk.
You could YouTube that. So anyway, like when I dug into it, it's like, oh, like why is this kid so lonely? It's like, oh, this was during the pandemic, and when they were hybrid learning, he got cyberbullied. And so I don't know, it became like I wasn't expecting this for that story, but it became a little bit of ways for me to honor the experience that myself and the students went through, and that became a really important part. I had to fight for it, honestly. Like, because I think most people still are like, oh, we don't want anything pandemic. I'm like, no, the story wouldn't be the story without. And it's not like pound you over the head. There's like just references to it, because really almost the whole story takes place in a week in April during his April vacation. So there's no discussion about like the vaccines, and it's about a close look at the family. So anyway, the cool part is I feel like I didn't really make any like concessions or big changes, or to me there's not a huge difference between writing that and what I wrote for an adult book. Like, I had to tone down some of the vocabulary, I guess. Not that I have like the world's best vocabulary to begin with. And there's no ambiguity, and the kid overcomes. Because if I wrote this as an adult novel, maybe the kid gets subsumed at the end, but I'm glad I wrote it the way I wrote it.
Do you want to tell us the name of the book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's called Another. Yeah. Just one word, Another. Yep.
It feels a little, the way that you describe it, one, it sounds amazing, but two, it gives a bit of a Goosebumps vibe, which I love. I don't know if that's a thing.
I mean, just through like osmosis. I mean, because I was definitely too old to be reading Goosebumps. I know my kids did. They read some, but it wasn't like I was reading Goosebumps aloud to them. I don't think that was the Goosebumps role for most people anyway. I don't think parents are reading Goosebumps aloud to their children.
I have, yeah. I don't know.
You have?
A good or
okay.
bad parent, but yeah.
No, that's cool. Yeah.
If you're willing to say much about this too, is that Survivor Song is a pandemic story, and kind of reading that it was published or at least finished prior to the pandemic, prior to our experience of the pandemic.
I didn't mean to write it. A pandemic novel. Yeah.
Does this feel a little bit like a return to that question, or did it end up being like a totally different kind of thing? Yeah,
totally different kind of thing. Cause Survivor Song, like even when writing it, so I started it July 2018 and finished edits, like including copy edits, November 2019. So, even before the first outbreak. Yeah. So, it was weird that there were so many weird coincidences. So, that book is very much about the fear of the moment of like this weird rabies that's happening. It's a 6-hour window. It's not like this is the initial holy shit, we're screwed, feel for the book. Obviously what Romola is trying to save her, her pregnant friend, who's been bitten, and that's the story. It's just the story of this intense like fear. What are we going to do? People are getting infected. So in Another, it's much more about just the personal experience and weirdness of, you went to school in and out of the classroom. Your friendships have changed, like your relationship with your sister is different and stuff like that. It was a much more personal story that way, and just what, this character who I named Casey, what he was thinking about and dealing with.
Well, again, all of that makes me very excited for that project to come out.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep. Agreed. I would just say, having heard that you've never read the Goosebumps, one of the questions that we asked from the interview sheet originally was looking at The Haunted Mask, which is like the 11th book in the Goosebumps series.
Which is one that I read to my kids. Sorry, Jeff. Yeah.
No, it's fine. And also there's the orange VHS Nickelodeon version of the Goosebumps one too.
The Haunted Mask is a frightening Halloween story about a girl named Carly Beth.
Speaking of horror, VHS. No, I like kept having all these flashbacks to it while reading a horror movie, and in the best possible ways. I'm not like suggesting at all that what you were doing was derivative of the Haunted Mask. Yeah. Just like seeing masks used in this way was really cool, because it's totally different what you're doing compared to what that book's doing. But now I might be slowly developing a fear of masks. So thank you.
Masks are weird things. I'm not like a huge slasher mask horror fan. There's some that I do like. So that was sort of part of the fun, was like, okay, how would I write this weird thing? Every story's already been written 1,000 times. And in horror, like to me, that's part of the fun. That's part of the anxiety. It's like, how is this going to be different? But that's also part of the fun. It's like, and hopefully you, as a writer, you try to get to the point where you're comfortable enough that your voice and your experience, aside from whatever else you put in the story, is going to help make it different. So that was initially part of the reason why I wanted to include the screenplay, because I was like, and there were tons of Curse Movies novels out. And actually, I was like, so not pissed, but I was like, man, like last year there were like 2 or 3 put out, Sylvia Marina Garcia had one, Josh Winning had one, which was a lot of fun. And I was like, oh, and there were like four, mine included, this year as well. It's just like everyone decided to write a curse movie book. So like, I mean, as a writer, you can't worry about, like, you can't go, oh, I can't write this vampire story because everyone's writing it. It's like, no, if that story is picking at your head enough that makes you want to write it, write it. You can't worry about what other people are doing because you'll never write anything if that's the case. Yeah, but so I'm glad, you enjoyed the experience. And honestly, like, that the mask is so familiar as a horror trope is a fun thing. You can both like lean into it, and then you can try to undercut like expectations, and all that's in play. Like, especially in horror, I think more time it's fun to do both, to lean into the expectations and also undercut them to keep people hopefully off balance.
Yeah, that's awesome. Before we let you go, wanted to ask if there's anything recently in horror that's provided some experience of joy, a movie, book, anything.
Yeah, so it's funny. I have a hard time explaining why this is joyful, but Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night, which is probably about 2 years old at this point, but like I can't stop talking about that book because I think it's one of the best books I've ever read. And I don't say that lightly. Like, you feel like you get to a certain age and your top like 3 or 5 books are fixed. It's like, no, that's one of the top 3 books I've ever read. I've already read it twice, and it's a fairly long, 800-page book that you could sort of describe as Roberto Bolaño meets cosmic horror, kind of Argentina instead of Chile. But yeah, it's just so, there's such awful things that happen in it, but it gave me joy because it was like, oh, I can't believe she wrote this. This is amazing. I don't know, like that weird transgression joy, like that's hard to explain for me anyway. Similarly, I don't know if I would describe this as joyful because it's such an intense, grueling movie, but Argentinian director did a movie When Evil Lurks, sorry. Yeah, there's a scene in that movie where you can see him sort of setting it up, and you're like, he's not going to do it, is he? Or if he is going to do it, it's not going to be in the way you think. And then it's horrifying. Like, I literally went, oh, but afterwards there's the weird joy. It's like, holy crap, I can't believe he did that. But like, there's joy in it because it was so effective. You both were expecting it, but even me telling you this, like, you're going to sort of know when it's coming, and it's still going to be shocking. and not shocking in a cheap, like, Gru kind of way, just shocking in like a legit, this is a brilliant like horror film moment.
And that's it, right? I think finding joy in those moments is, I think, what we're trying to really find and celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us. This was an incredible conversation. So this is Horror Movie. It is out now anywhere you buy your books, and it is out by William Morrow. It's an incredible book. The story is incredible. The format's incredible. I think this is high on the list for recommendations. So thank you for taking time to talk to us about it.
Thank you. My pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can do this again. And I'll tell you right now that we're definitely going to be reading the next one as a family. So
nice.
Maybe we can do this again. And thank you. Hope the book is incredibly successful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, definitely. We'll have to do it for another.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.